Okay, well, thank you for letting me join you. I'm not usually on the East Coast on a Saturday morning, so the magic of Zoom, if we can keep it working, will allow this to go on. So Ken asked me to talk about RTTY contesting today in your meeting in the context of the next big RTTY contest that's coming up next weekend, which is the lead off for the WIPIX series of contests through the three modes. So RTTY will be this time next weekend. And these are the topics that I'm going to cover this morning. I'll have some comments about the contest to start off, and then the bulk of the talk is about some specific topics in RTTY contesting. So rather than slog through beginning to end, setting up and operating RTTY, I've just picked 10 topics. The first 7 are pretty common to everything that we do in RTTY contesting, and the last 3 are more quote unquote advanced techniques that, you know, if you're just getting started in RTTY contesting, may not be on your agenda right now, but for other people, you might want to talk about some of those aspects. So the CQ Worldwide RTTY DX contest is a DX contest, sort of, I say, because of the scoring structure. The multiplier structure in particular, being prefixes, makes a WD5 in Texas as valuable as a Bouvet contact. And from North America, your points, your QSO points, are the same if you work a KH6 or a PY2 or an Antarctica station such as Bouvet. So it's somewhat of a DX contest, but it allows small stations on either coast to really have a lot of fun, rack up a lot of multipliers, and a fairly decent score. If you put a few hours in on the weekend, you can easily get to 1 million points. So the East Coast, of course, has access to all the European prefixes, and those of us on the West Coast are always complaining about our disadvantage of being so far from Europe. But in a contest like this, we have access to JAs and lots of YBs these days with lots of different prefixes, and of course, China. The second comment I'd make is that I like to think of WPX as a low band contest because of the double points that you get on the low bands on 40 and 80 here on RTTY. And of course, that's not strictly true because lots of prefixes won't be on the low bands. You'll find lots of prefixes, especially here in North America in the States, that are on the high bands and just don't have low band capabilities. You need to be able to work all bands, but generally I like to think of it as a low band contest just to encourage myself to make sure that I spend a lot of time on the low bands, especially 40 meters. And then lastly, one interesting thing about this contest is that your score increases exponentially because of all of the multipliers, a high number of multipliers. Even towards the end of the contest, every handful of QSOs, you're going to get a new multiplier on average. And so the score increases dramatically, and that adds to the interest and the fun. When on Sunday, when you may be tired, you still get that adrenaline push with additional multipliers. There are some differences between the RTTY version of WIPIX and CW and sideband. The first difference that I'll note is that the single ops have a scoring time of 30 hours versus 36 hours. WIPIX, when it was first created, was 30 hours, but about 15 years ago, the director of the contest was getting a lot of pressure from DXpeditions about the 30-hour time, that they were going to all this expense and trouble to go to other locations, and could only operate 30 hours. And so the director caved in and increased it to 36 hours, but in RTTY we kept it at 30 hours, which becomes a strategy element to figure out which 30 hours to operate. You notice that I call this scoring time, which may seem kind of odd, but I do that to make the point to people that you can operate as a single op, you can operate the full 48 hours. You know, the rules say that you can only operate 30 hours or 36 hours in CW and sideband. And that's really kind of the wrong wording, because you can operate the whole time. It's just that your log is scored on the first 30 hours. So oftentimes if I'm feeling good and having a good time on Sunday and my 30 hours, or if it's CW 36 hours run out, I just keep operating and enjoy the contest, which is one of the main reasons why we do it, I think. The second point is that there's no 160 with RTTY. And in fact, on CW and sideband, there's very little 160 operation anyway, because even the SO2R guys are going to be on 80 and 40. 40 for sure, and 80 is going to be a lot more productive than 160. You're just not going to add to your score that much. So that's not much of a difference from a practical standpoint, because I don't think 160 is used that much in the other modes anyway. The biggest difference is in the scoring. There's two details in the scoring for RTTY that are more generous, shall we say. The first one is that same country QSOs, that is when you work another US station, you get 2 points on the low bands, whereas in the other modes, you just get 1 point on the low bands. And if anybody on any continent that works a different country gets the 2 or 4 points that North America gets in the other modes, not just 1 or 2. For some reason, North America has this this bias of getting twice the points of QSOs between different countries within their continent compared to the other 5 continents. Okay, let's move on into RTTY. The first topic I'd like to talk about is AFSK versus FSK. Those terms are thrown around, and in fact, FSK is often used synonymously with RTTY when describing this mode, and that's not strictly true. So to understand the terminology, AFSK and FSK are terms that refer to how the transmission is done in your station. That is the method by which you transmit. It has nothing to do with receive. It only has to do with the transmit side of your station and the method that you use, whether it's AFSK, where you're using audio into the sideband transmitter circuitry of your radio, or whether you're actually keying the radio like you would with CW, exactly the same way as CW, but going into a RTTY keying jack and using push to talk to key the radio. But on the receive side, the audio from the radio going into the sound card and the decoder in your computer is absolutely identical. So if the AFSK being transmitted from your QSO partner is set up properly, or if it's FSK, you cannot tell the difference on the receive end. There is no difference. It's only on the transmit side in your station that these two terms apply. And one difference that is kind of going by the wayside now with our more modern radios, the current generation of radios, is that the mark frequency is the frequency that we use to describe what RTTY frequency we're operating on. So if you spot a station, you spot the mark frequency. And the definition of the mark frequency is the higher RF frequency. So as you know, RTTY has 2 carriers, if you will, 2 like CW signals that are 170 hertz apart. And the higher one in the RF spectrum is the mark frequency. The lower one is called space. And these are terms from the old time RTTY operation that persist to today. But FSK on the older generation radios, if you selected the RTTY mode, or sometimes called FSK mode, the display, your VFO display on the radio, will display the mark frequency, which is great because that's consistent with how you communicate what frequency you're transmitting on. But in the older radios that use AFSK, the sideband modes are used, and what's displayed on the radio, of course, is the suppressed carrier, not the offset for the mark or the space signal, which is the audio tones you're using in your local station. And so this is why even today, sometimes you'll get spots that are off by a couple of kilohertz. And the reason for that is that it's somebody that's spotting using their dial frequency, and they're using AFSK, and what you're getting is their local audio frequency offset in the spot. That's less of a concern today because radios like the K3, the K4, the flex radios all display the mark frequency in the VFO, regardless of what mode you're in. Okay, next topic is a few comments about receiving. One of the things that I know I did wrong when I got started with RTTY is thinking, just like on CW, that if I put a narrow filter around my my RTTY receive signal, that it would decode better, right? It would filter out QRM. Well, it turns out that's not the case, and the reason is that the decoders that we use today, the software decoders, have been designed assuming that they have a flat, unbiased spectrum, audio spectrum that they're working with. And so they use the sidebands on the outside of the signals for information to decide what their decoding conclusion is. So your error rate will actually go up a little bit if you put a narrow filter. And what I used to do, and I think a lot of people do, is they think, well, gee, the signals are 170 hertz apart, so I'll put a 250 hertz bandpass filter in my radio. I'll turn the filter down to 250 hertz, and that'll give me a nice tight filter around the signal. The problem with that, and you can see it in this top signal diagram. This is the audio spectrum. This happens to be MMTTY, but the same thing would exist with two-tone. There's no signal here. This is just the background noise, band noise and receiver noise. And you can see that it's not flat, it's rounded off. And that's the effect of this 250 hertz filter. And what you really want to have is a 500 hertz filter or greater, but nothing less than 500 hertz, because anything smaller than 500 hertz starts to roll off the spectrum and creates this bias in there that messes up the spectrum. And by the same token, do not use tone filters. You know, ICOM kind of pioneered years ago the idea of the feature of the twin peak filter, which put two peaking filters around the two tones, the two carriers. And everybody, again, with a CW background, thought, well, gee, this is great to have this filtering. And I was a big proponent in the beta test days, or the field test days of the K3 back in 2007, I guess it was, and advocated for them to put in a dual tone filter. So they actually put in some DSP filters around the tones. So that was a different technique than what ICOM was using, but it had the same impact as what I talked up here above, in that it created a spectrum that was very biased and actually decreased the decoding reliability. And so don't use twin peak filters or dual tone filters. Turn those off and use a 500 hertz filter in the receiver. So here's what it would look like with a 500 hertz filter with just band noise, and that's what the decoders want to see. The point here on this slide is to make sure that you set your audio level so that the no signal is at about 5% or less. In other words, you just want the noise tickling the bottom of the screen. And the reason for that is to give you the maximum dynamic range in the DAC. Usually that's not a problem with most of our computers and sound cards nowadays, but you're best to put this as low as you can do and just get a little bit of noise tickle here. That will allow you to decode very weak signals that are down in the noise. And then when loud signals come in, it won't overload your DAC. And you can control that, of course, in two places. There's the Windows recording volume control in the applet that's in the operating system. And then the receiver usually has an audio level control as well. Another technique that I like to recommend to people is to learn to tune RTTY by ear. Now, you're not going to copy RTTY. You're not going to decode it like you would with sideband or CW in your brain, but you want to be able to quickly zero beat tune in a signal. And so just like with CW or with sideband, you want to train your brain to be able to hear and be able to tune in. And anybody can learn to do this in about 10 or 15 minutes. If you just get on and just listen to RTTY for a few minutes, close your eyes and tune to where you think the signal is zero beat, and then open your eyes and look at the screen and see how close you are. Do that for about 10 minutes, and you'll train yourself to be able to tune for whatever tones you're using in your local setup. You can use, the default tones are up around 2 kilohertz, but you can use any tone pair you want. I like to use as low tones as I can. I typically use about 910 hertz, and I think it's 1085, just because it's much less fatiguing over a long period of time in a contest to listen to lower tones than higher tones. Also in receiving, if you use AFC, which is automatic frequency control, this is a nice feature on the one hand, in that when you tune close to a signal, the decoder will adjust where it's listening to automatically zero beat. So it'll automatically change the frequency that it's listening to effectively zero beat. And so a lot of people think, oh, well, that's great. The problem with that is that if you go to, that's great if you're running and your transmit is fixed. But if you're in search and pounce mode and you're tuning around and you tune into a signal, the AFC will grab and move your receive signal away from your transmit signal. And so you will no longer be zero beat in your own station, and you'll be transmitting off frequency relative to your QSO partner. And this happens all the time in RTTY contests, and it's usually because the other operator forgets to either turn off AFC or enable a second feature, which is called NET, N-E-T, that automatically moves your transmit audio tones to match whatever the AFC set up for where it was listening on the audio tones. So it kind of negates or cancels out the AFC that you had and makes you zero beat. I hate all of this messing around with my audio frequencies personally, and so I have never used AFC. I just use the RIT if someone's off frequency, like I would with CW or sideband, and then I never need to worry about this issue. But That's not to say that it's wrong or bad to use AFC. Just make sure that when you're in search and pounce that you either turn it off or use turn on net. And I should comment that if you're transmitting with FSK, you're not able to do this, right? Because FSK is just keying the transmitter, and the transmitter, whatever your radio is set up for whatever tone pairs, is going to be fixed, and so that can't change. So net only works with AFSK transmitters. AFC, of course, works with both modes, and so if you're using FSK, your only alternative is to disable AFC when you go to search and pounce. Okay, on the transmitting side, the first thing that you have to be very careful about in RTTY is to make sure that your audio is set up correctly. And there's two things to look at there. One is to make sure that the sideband processor is turned off. And again, this is less of a problem now because most radios today, like the Flex, for example, doesn't do FSK transmission, only does AFSK. And when you go to that mode, it automatically turns off the processor, so you don't need to worry about that. But again, with an older radio, you might have the processor turned on from operating sideband. You need to make sure that that is turned off. And then secondly, you need to make sure that the audio level is enough to give you full power output, but not anymore, because beyond that, you may overdrive the transmitter and have distortion because of overdrive. So you have to be very careful about that. That's one reason why I personally like using FSK, because in the heat of the contest, I don't have to worry about whether I've misadjusted these the audio level. This next topic is a real pet peeve of mine, and it's the topic of transmit bandwidth, and it's analogous to CW key clicks that was a real problem, especially with the ASU radios a number of years ago, with the rise and fall time being too sharp and creating wide bandwidth CW. The same thing can happen with RTTY with wide signals, and it can happen both with AFSK and with FSK transmissions. So a wide RTTY signal can wipe out a whole handful of potential channels of activity that could be on the band. And you hurt you not only QRM other stations, but you hurt yourself, because by putting energy into a wide signal, that is not helping decoding on the other end. So it's to your advantage to have a narrow transmit signal as well, so that you're putting all your energy into the area that's being decoded on the other side. So I'm going to go through a couple of graphs just to illustrate the point here. The upper left graph is MMTTY unfiltered. So this is AFSK transmission, and there's no filtering in the encoder, that is in the MMTTY software. The upper right signal is with some filtering, and the filtering on transmit in MMTTY is a tap setting. I won't go into what all that means, but the higher the number of taps, the narrower the transmit filter is. So the default, when you install MMTTY, the default is 48 taps. If you don't change anything in MMTTY, you'll get 48 taps, and you'll get this upper right transmit signal, which is pretty nice. You can see it's narrower than the unfiltered in the upper left. But in the lower left is 512 tap settings. So you can go into MMTTY, and I encourage everybody to do this, and increase the taps to 512, and you can see that you get a narrower signal. And then in the lower right is two-tone AFSK, and two-tone has none of these adjustments. It's set up for the optimum narrow bandwidth, transmit bandwidth, and so there's nothing to adjust in two-tone, and you'll get that signal there, and you'll see it's equivalent to the 512 tap bandwidth in MMTTY. Also, two-tone has an alternative to, they have AFSK setting and an alternative DOOK, digital on-off keying, and you can see that it's even a little bit narrower, and that's what David G3YYD recommends using is this setting in two-tone, which gives you an even narrower signal. Another consideration is the power. The more power you use, your power amplifier, whether it's 100 watt or a power amplifier, a kilowatt amplifier, is going to generate intermod, and that's just a matter of fact with amplifiers. And so this graphs show how the bandwidth increases due to intermod just on the basis of power. So on the upper left, we're showing MMTTY with the tight filtering at 1 milliwatt. And in the upper right, the same signal, the only thing that's changed is moving the transmitter up to 100 watts. And you can see how the signal widens out. And if we were to show a kilowatt, it gets even worse. So you can imagine what that looks like. And then the bottom graph is just a comment about the K3 and K4 radios that have filtering, AFSK filtering, and FSK, by the way, filtering in the radio itself. And it's every bit as good as the MMTTY filtering that's in the encoders you compare to the upper right there. And so if you use both of those together, you'll get an even narrower signal, which is good to use. In the K3, I believe now, I can't remember if you can turn that off. It may be on all the time anyway, and so that's a good thing. So all of the previous talking was about, or slides was about AFSK. This is some graphs on FSK. And most radios, with the exception of the K3 and K4, and perhaps some of the modern Japanese radios, current generation radios, in FSK mode, do no wave shaping. And in fact, when the K3 firmware first came out in the early 2000s, it didn't do any wave shaping. And we worked with the designers, and they added DSP wave shaping in 2013. And you can see the upper and lower graphs, the comparison there of what that does. So even with FSK, you can get equally narrow filtering in the transmitted signal, but only with certain radios. And so that's a problem, and I would advise people that if you're using a radio that doesn't have FSK wave shaping, that you probably ought to use AFSK and do the filtering that I talked about in the previous slides, so that you're not QRMing other stations, and so that you're concentrating all of your power into responsibly narrow signal for decoding on the other end. Okay, next topic is unshift on space, or UOS. Sometimes you'll see this called USOS for unshift on space. And what it is a technique that a creative person developed years ago that was based on the premise that most transmission is letters, especially in the news media where teletype was used for news. Most of the text was letters as compared to numbers. And if you're not familiar with RTTY, if you're new to RTTY, RTTY uses a 5-bit code, which gives you 32 states. And as a result, you can't get numbers and letters all in 32 states, obviously. And so, from 150 years ago, RTTY has always had two character sets, and you switch between them. That is, the transmitter sends a control character to tell the receiver that I'm going to start sending numbers now. So you need to switch your decoding over to the figures character set for numbers and a number of punctuation and other characters. And so these control characters could get hit by noise. So you can imagine if you had a stream of text going along and there was a number in it, a control character would be sent to say shift to the number character set, and then the number would be sent. And if you went back to text, another control character would be sent to go back to text. And if either one of those control characters got hit by noise and got garbled, the receiver on the other end would not change character sets. And so all the text that would follow would be gibberish until another control character was sent. So the idea was to generate a shift back to text character set whenever a space character came, because there's lots of spaces being sent, right? Between every set of words, there's a space. And so the idea is that by using unshift on space, whenever a space is sent, the receiver automatically shifts back into the text or the letters character set without a control character being sent. So this is kind of gives you a bit of noise immunity. On the other hand, it has the adverse consequence of messing things up if one side is not using UOS and the other side is. And so the bottom line here on the bottom of this slide is to turn on both receive and transmit UOS and use space delimiters. So what's transmit UOS? Well, that means that if you're in the UOS, the unshift on space mode, when you transmit after a space, you have to send a figures character, right? Because the space on the other end is going to automatically shift the receiver back into the letter space. And so if your next word starts with a figure, a number, you're going to have to send a figures character after the space. And so that's what transmit UOS means. So the bottom line with all of this, if you didn't follow all the detail of that, is to make sure that UOS is turned on. It turns out that in MMTTY, there's two different places that you turn on receive unshift on space versus transmit. And this is where they are in the setup menus. In two-tone, it's automatically, UOS is automatically used. And in some other, like the tiny FSK code for the Arduino for FSK keying is automatically set up for UOS. In other words, you're not able to turn it off. So if you're using those devices or code two-tone, you don't need to worry about this. But in MMTTY, you want to make sure that they're both enabled. So let's look at what a WYPIC's basic QSO sequence looks like. And the black here is the running station, and the orange is the search and pounce station. In RTTY, typically instead of starting out with in our CQ message with a CQ, we often just send something that indicates what the contest is, so that if a casual listener tunes across, they know that this is a contest station. And then in RTTY, the convention is to end the CQ message with a CQ. And then the second phase of the QSO here, of course, is is the person, the other station calling. Could be a pileup or a single call. You send the running station sends their report, and then the search and pounce station sends their report. Sending the call sign is optional. I never send the call sign at this point. A lot of people do, just to, it doesn't take that much extra time, but it guarantees that everybody knows who's working who. But I personally don't do that, so that's optional. And then the final QSL message from the running station serves as the CQ for the next contact. So the idea here is to keep the messages short, just as you would with CW or sideband. No extraneous info. I mention this because in 20 years ago, in RTTY contests, almost all the messages were way longer than they needed to be. Lots of extraneous information. The signal report 599 was, believe it or not, sent more than once. And that is just, of course, totally unnecessary. If that gets garbled, you kind of don't care, because everyone is just sending 599 as kind of a sync part of the exchange for copying the exchange in this case, which is a serial number. In RTTY, you want to send any unique exchange information twice. And so in WPX, you want to send the serial number twice. And the reason for that is that if on the receive side, if they get the same serial number, then they can be reasonably assured that they copied it correctly. If it's different, of course, then they can ask for a repeat. As I said earlier, use space, not hyphen. Don't use DE. This is something else that was built into some of the early RTTY software. So don't use DE in other contests. That gets confused with Delaware, of course. And then oftentimes, depending on what software you're using, this is a write log example. There are special RTTY characters. %R and write log enacts the push to talk. So that's at the beginning of all the messages you can see here. And then %E is at the end of all the messages, which shuts off transmission. You'll see I have a couple of messages in here that don't have the %E on the end. And that's because that's a message that I always follow with another message. I won't go into what that is right now, but if you have messages that are like that you're going to concatenate or add another message on the end of it, then you don't want to drop the transmission in the middle. So this is just what I already talked about, the spaces between, of course, all the elements, and then these special characters that may be required depending on the software you use. Okay, subbands. Be familiar with where the subbands are. This URL here at the bottom, Don Hill AA5AU, has a web page that tells you where the RTTY subbands are for contesting and for general operation. And avoid places where you know there's likely to be transmission. For example, the Northern California DX Foundation beacons, are on 24/7. And so just avoid those frequencies. Even if you can't hear them, you'll be QRMing somebody else that may be wanting to copy them. And then, of course, the digital frequencies on 20 meters, for example, between about 070 and about 083 are the digital frequencies, primarily the FT8 and FT4 modes nowadays. And so, again, even if you can't hear something there, there's a lot of activity and you may be QRMing somebody that you can't hear. As far as other areas to avoid, I get a couple of emails after every contest during the year of somebody complaining about these darn RTTY contesters QRMing my set net frequency or whatever. And the only problem with that is if you get on and look at people that have staked out, or a frequency that have been staked out, the entire amateur radio spectrum is staked out by somebody for some purpose. And so basically we just have to fall back on the fundamental principle of listen before you transmit. Make sure that you're not transmitting on a frequency that's in use. If it's not in use, then you can consider it available for yourself to use. So some considerations that are different about RTTY compared to other modes is that, well, first of all, I would say don't just assume that everything about RTTY needs to be different. I try to make it the same. For example, we talked about messages earlier. There's no reason to have long RTTY messages in contesting. So mirroring what we do in CW and sideband where we can is a good model to follow. But RTTY is different in some ways because there's not the human brain doing decoding. You need to repeat unique parts of your messages, such as serial numbers. An established practice in RTTY is to put the CQ at the end of the message. I won't go into why that makes sense, because it doesn't make any more sense on RTTY than it does in CW or the other modes. But it's so ingrained in RTTY operation now that if you don't put a CQ at the end, it causes confusion on the band. So it's just one of those things that over many, many decades of practice, we continue to do that. And so I advise you to do it, even though it's not what we would do in the other modes. The third point here is to turn down your local headphone volume. Since you're not copying, you're not decoding, you don't need to hear precisely what's going on. You only need to know the presence or absence of your monitor signal or somebody else's signal in your receiver coming back to you, only for the purposes of timing your transmit. So turn it down. The reason for turning it down is that it lowers your fatigue over the contest period. And so anything you can do to lower the tiresome fatiguing aspects, such as high tones or high volume, is to your advantage to keep you as fresh as you can through the contest period. The fourth point here is to remember that RTTY is a key down transmission. It's like the old alpha ads from back in the 70s and 80s, where they would literally put a brick on a manual CW key and talk about how their amplifiers could go for 24 hours key down with 100% duty cycle. Well, RTTY is exactly that mode, because when the mark frequency is off, when it's not transmitting, the space frequency is on. So mark and space are basically redundant. When one's on, the other one's off. And so you always are transmitting RF at full power. And to that point, a lot of the older amplifiers in the operating manual recommend on RTTY to reduce the power to 800 watts or 1,000 watts, just for that reason. And then finally, with RTTY, because you're not doing the decoding in your head, lots of times if you're SO1R and the rate's not real high, it's real tempting to do other things, because your brain begins to wander. So you'll start to watch a sports game on TV, or do email, or read, or do something else. And so it's real tempting to get distracted from the contest. One of the things that happens to all of us, whether you're experienced or not, is you start receiving gibberish. You don't get text that makes sense on the screen. And most often that's due to one of these items here on the screen. We talk about upside down code. And what that means is where mark and space are reversed. And this can happen from a number of different ways. If you're using upper sideband instead of lower sideband, or in your transmitter, most transmitters have the ability to select whether a high digital tone in the keying input on FSK is a mark or a space, and so you can change that logic. And so if any of those things get reversed, you'll be sending marks instead of spaces, and vice versa. And of course, that will mess up the coding. Figures versus letters can be messed up. And we talked about the unshift on space. If you have it off and your QSO partner has it on, that can result in your being in the wrong character set. So one hint here, one tip, is that when you're the difference between figures and letters, you notice on a keyboard, all of the figures are on this top row here, and the corresponding 5-bit code in the other character set, in the letter character set, is right below these keys. So for example, W and 2 have the same 5-bit code in RTTY, but 2 is in the figures character set and W is in the letters character set. So what this means is if you get, like up here in this example, TOOWPIR, what you're expecting is 599 and a serial number. And if you look, TOO, T is 5 and O is 9. And so you can translate that just by looking at your keyboard. But there's an even faster way with N1MM or WriteLog or WinTest, is if you hold the shift key down when you go up here and you click on this. So if I come up to this serial number, I put my cursor on the W, keep losing my cursor here, put my cursor on the W and hold down the shift key. When I click that in to my software, it will automatically convert it to the serial number, whatever the serial number was. In this case, 24, what is it? WPIR 2484, and that will be a very fast way to do it. So if you notice that, you can just very quickly convert. And in fact, N1MM has a nice feature that it automatically, in the entry window, displays the reverse. And so you don't even have to click on anything. You can see immediately if that's what the problem is with the gibberish that you're receiving. And then other things that can affect this are audio levels and tones. If you're using the wrong tones between your software and your radio, they have to be consistent, have to be the same. And then of course the other station signal could be just a poor signal. On transmit, the same thing can happen. You could be transmitting in the wrong polarity and be reversed. And so even though you may be calling a very strong signal, a very strong station that is not having anybody else calling them, and you're not getting them picking you up, it could be that you're upside down, or more likely that you're off frequency. And I talked about this earlier. You have AFC on with net on or off, and or you're using FSK with AFC on, and you're just off frequency, and so they just haven't tuned you in. Just a couple of other tips that actually aren't unique to RTTY, but apply to all modes, is to practice. And there's lots of ways you can practice RTTY. You may have realized, of course, that there's almost no RTTY on outside of contests. Even the DXpeditions now are predominantly using the FT modes. And so the only time you can copy RTTY is through the ARRL bulletin a couple times each day, or during contests. But there are on average 2 or 3 RTTY contests every month. So on the weekends, you can get on and operate for a few minutes or an hour or so and practice RTTY or check out your station and get things tuned up. So that's a good way to practice. You don't have to be totally committed to the contest, but you can use it as a test bed for practicing. And the other nice way to practice is every Thursday night, there's a 30-minute sprint sponsored by our contest club out here in Triple C for RTTY. It's followed half an hour later by a CW sprint. And so those two modes can be practiced every week. There's also a sideband sprint, I think, on Tuesdays, I believe it is, that's sponsored by another group. And then, of course, another great way to learn operating techniques, both on RTTY and other modes, is to participate in multi-ops. There's nothing like being able to operate with other operators side by side to learn contesting compared to listening to a presentation like what we're doing now. Okay, I'm going to take a break from RTTY for a few seconds here and go into another competitive domain, which is sailboat racing, and talk about a concept that I call slow down to win. You know, in contesting or in any competitive sport, speed is usually a key factor in most competitive sports. And so you're always thinking about trying to go faster and faster and faster. But there's some instances, there's some cases during the competition where that works to your disadvantage. And so here's an example in sailboat racing of how that works. In buoy racing, which a lot of sailboat racing is, they'll set up 1 or 2 or 3 buoys out on a body of water, and the sailboats will race around those buoys. When you come to a buoy, which are called marks in sailboat racing, of course, it's illegal to touch another boat. You can't crash into another boat. And so there's only physical room for one boat to be next to the mark. All the other boats have to be on the outside. So if these two boats are approaching the mark here and they're neck to neck, they're overlapped, as we say in sailboat racing, they're coming up to the mark, this outside boat is going to go a further distance. And by the time they get around the mark, it's going to fall behind. So just by virtue of going around this buoy, they're going to lose ground. They're going to fall behind in the race. And so the technique to do, I don't have a slide to show it, but the technique to do would be for this outside boat, as they approach the mark, is to slow down, to slough off, as we would say in sailboat racing, and to fall behind this boat and get right behind them, to get right behind them and come into the mark to go the shorter distance. And in some cases, if there's a wind shift or something happens and enough space is developed here, they may be able to sneak in and get between the mark and the other boat and actually get ahead of them going around the mark. But in any case, they'll lose less ground if they follow the other boat into the mark rather than trying to go on the outside. So the bottom line of all of this, the net takeaway, is there's some instances where it makes sense to slow down to win. And that's an introduction to this next topic, which is call sign stacking. And now I'm going to get into 3 topics that I call advanced topics that are kind of after you've learned the RTTY mode and you've done some RTTY contesting, you may want to move on to some of these techniques. And so in call sign stacking, this is where in a pileup, if you get more than one person calling, you stack or you capture more than one call. So instead of just immediately coming back to the first station that you decode, you slow down. Instead of hitting the transmit key and sending your message, your exchange message, you just wait what I call a beat. In other words, a fraction of a second, and try to get at least one more call sign printed on your screen. And at 45 baud, at 60 words a minute, that comes pretty fast. So you don't lose much time. And you just wait a second if you sense that there's going to be another call. If you get that other call, as soon as you get it printed, go ahead and send your message to the first call. And while that message is being sent, then you can click that second call into your stack. And the stack is used to just remember that call so you can use it in a subsequent message to work that station, which I'll show you in a minute. But the first point here is to slow down to win. That is to just wait and get that second call so that you can do the call stacking that we're going to talk about next. So to talk about call stacking, we first of all have to have a common understanding about the QSO phases. CT1BOH calls QSO phases moments, but I have an electrical engineering degree, and we were required to take mechanical engineering courses. And of course, we learned about moments in physics and mechanical engineering. And so I prefer to call these instances within a QSO phases. So in a normal run QSO or run side of a QSO, there are 4 phases. There's the CQ phase, you call CQ. Then there's a pileup. Then you send your exchange to one of the stations in the pileup, and then they come back with their exchange, and those are the 4 phases of a QSO. Now you might say, wait a minute, there's a 5th phase, and that's the QSL message, right? You say thank you that you've received your QSO partner's exchange, and I claim that that's really the same as the first phase because it's an equivalent CQ message. Yes, you're giving a QSL, but it's also the CQ message that starts this sequence all over again. In other words, you say thank you, and the pileup then starts again, which is phase 2, and then over here is the same thing for search and pounce. So what I'm claiming is there's 4 phases in a QSO. So for call sign stacking, what you can do is in a pileup, if you get 2 or more stations calling, here we've got K3LR and K5ZD are in this pileup. Say you come back to the first one, and by the way, that's your choice, which call sign that you come back to first. If the second call sign is a mult, a lot of people want to come back to the mult. I personally do not do that because I want to train the pileup. I want to encourage the pileup to give me short calls. And so I always come back to the first person that decodes. And that's just my personal preference. It's not necessarily a recommendation. It's just what I personally choose to do. So anyway, in this example, we come back, we send the exchange to K3LR, and they send their exchange, thank you. And instead of me sending my QSL message to K3LR, I send that along with the exchange for K5ZD. So guess what I did? I went from phase 4, I went from phase 4 back to phase 3 for the next QSO. I skipped phases 1 and 2. So effectively what this does, as long as you can keep pulling calls out without going back to the CQ and pileup phase, you are doubling your rate instantaneously. You're getting twice the QSO rate that you would otherwise get. And you can do the same thing with tail ending. So if say there was only one call in the pileup, but during this exchange, if Randy came back and dropped his call in once at the appropriate time and didn't QRM the exchange, I can pick that up and go directly into phase 3 and work Randy for the next QSO and skip the CQ and pileup stage. So admittedly, this is, I don't get the opportunity to do this as much from W0YK here in California as I do from a DX location like Aruba, but it's still, I get to do it a little bit, and it's just a lot of fun when it happens, and it's a lot of fun when you can do it 2 or 3 or 4 in a row and avoid the CQing. So this is just a slide that talks about how you work with the stack, depending on the software, whether it's N1MM or WriteLog, how the stack works, the details of that is a little different, but in general, you're pushing calls onto the stack. And I only push calls on while the message is going out to the first QSO. So I work, you want to quickly, work the first call sign that you get, send a message to that. And while that message is going out, you got a few seconds to click in or to push additional calls onto your stack so that when you go to that QSL message that I talked about in the previous slide, you can automatically go to the next call and pop that off the stack. And I use the terms push and pop in N1MM. The details on how you do that are different than what we do in WriteLog. Okay, next topic is multiple decoders. So one of the great things about using software decoders in RTTY is that they're free. The only cost is screen space. That is, if your display screen is large enough to have multiple windows on it. And if you scrunch them down to make them as small as possible, just maximize the area where the text is printed, you can get multiple screens on the multiple decoder windows on your LCD screen. So what are the decoders that we have? The first one that came out, was introduced a couple decades ago, was MMTTY. It's kind of the long-standing standard of decoders. It still is an excellent decoder. All the major contest loggers use it, and so it's available. It works standalone, so it's a good way to test your station without getting involved with the logger. So it's just a somewhat simpler way to get started. Probably the most popular decoder nowadays is two-tone, which was introduced 10 years ago by David Wick's W0YK, and it's also in all of the contest loggers. And then there's one called Gritty that a few people use. It's a very high performance decoder. It has some techniques that will decode in certain situations where the other two decoders will not. It's really only integrated nicely within N1MM, but you can use it standalone with other loggers. So there's different decoders that are available. So here's an example of two decoder windows. This is WriteLog and MMTTY, and the top window here is an MMTTY RTTY window. The bottom one is using a hardware decoder, the HAL DXP38. I don't use that anymore nowadays, but I used to. It has some advantages over the software decoders, but not enough that I go to the trouble to setting it up anymore. But here's an example of that. And why would you want to have multiple decoders? Well, it turns out every decoder, especially the difference between a hardware decoder and a software decoder, use different algorithms. And so one decoder may print garbage where another one will get clear copy. Yeah. If you're only using one decoder and you're printing garbage, you have to ask for a repeat. If you have multiple decoders and if just one of them copies clearly, you save a lot of time without having to go into a repeat cycle, and can grab the information from the one that copies correctly. So since they're free, you can have as many as you want. My typical operation is on my main VFO on each radio, I have 4 decoders going. In my case, one of them is, well, let's talk to this slide. This is a slide that is all MMTTY, but they're different because each of these decoders, MMTTY decoders, uses a different software algorithm for decoding. MMTTY has a half a dozen what they call profiles, and there's a standard profile. There's one that's optimized for fluttered signals, one that's optimized for multipath signals. There's one that's optimized for that's more sensitive. Dave A6YQ did a special decoder. And so you could have all of these set up. And I can tell you from experience that 5% of the time, one of these decoders will decode correctly. The other 3 will be garbage. And so I'm very thankful that I have those various decoders. Another thing that you can do is you can set up your second receiver. If you have 2 receivers in your radio, you can set up the second receiver for a different IF bandwidth and put a decoder on that and have that for decoding, and then have it on the same frequency as your other receiver and have that variation as well. Here is the way that you can do SO2V, that is 2 VFOs on different frequencies in the same radio. And so here's 6 decoders. The red ones are on the main VFO. The gray ones here are on the sub VFO, or the second receiver. And this allows you to be, say, running on the main VFO and tuning the second VFO for multipliers or unworked stations around the band, and interleaving QSOs, search and pounce QSOs with run QSOs for SO2V. So one of the things you can do with multiple decoders, especially if you're using SO2V, is to use different audio tones for the 2 different receivers, so that you might use higher tones for the second receiver, and mix the streams in your ear so that you know the low tones are your main decoder, the high tones are your sub-receiver decoder, so you can keep those straight in terms of your timing of transmissions. So this is a slide I won't go over in detail, but you can look at later about how to do SO2V, depending on whether you have just a single receiver or if you have 2 receivers in your radio. SO2R is a great technique to use with RTTY, because you're not using brain cells to decode. You can learn the techniques of SO2R, the mechanics, if you will, of SO2R, and RTTY is a great test bed to do that. And so if you're interested in SO2R in any mode, I suggest that you practice it in RTTY, because you'll be able to get the automatic behavior down of SO2R, and then go back to the other modes where you're using your brain for decoding. So, excuse me, one of the choices you have in SO2R with any mode, by the way, is whether you use 2 computers, 2 keyboards. Well, within 1mm, you can actually use 2 keyboards and 1 computer, but for my presentation here, I'm using two different computers, 2 different displays, 2 keyboards, and a few contesters do this in CW and sideband as well. And this means you don't have to do any context switching in the software. You don't have to do any keystrokes to change your focus, so to speak, from one radio to the other. It's physical. And so you just physically move from keyboard to keyboard to do the SO2R. And one of the nice things I like about this is if I use the same radio, all the same hardware on both sides, if something goes wrong in a contest, I've got redundancy there. I can keep operating on one side and while I'm troubleshooting the other side. And because they're the same, I can quickly compare the two to aid in my troubleshooting efforts. One of the details for those of you that are interested in doing this, you'll notice that I use a left-hand mouse or trackball on the left-hand radio. And I'm normally right-handed, but on my office computer about 20 years ago, I started using a left-handed mouse so that I trained my left hand in the non-contest computer operations to be very good at running the mouse with my left hand. So I can run a mouse or a trackball equally well with either hand, and that helps me here with this technique for SO2R. This is a slide that you can go through later that talks about how you can do SO2R in the sprint by setting 2 different frequencies, at least 5 kilohertz apart, to maximize your transmit time and in the sprint. So one of the nice things about using multiple computers, network computers for SO2R, is that you can do SONR. For example, here's a setup from years ago that I used for SO3R. So you can see I had my main station set up, left and right radios here, as we showed in the previous slide. But off to the side, I set up a third station. And in this particular contest, it was dedicated to 10 meters. And it allowed me to monitor 10 meters and to instantly transmit on 10 meters if there was a multiplier or something that came up. Now, I couldn't operate, there just isn't enough time to interleave 3 stations and keep maintain 3 different run station frequencies, or to search and pounce on one of these and keep 2 run stations going. But it allows for an instant QSY to pick up multipliers or to move a station or whatever. And so basically what this is physically is a multi setup, right? It's 3 independent stations that are networked together, all using the same log, but they're close in physical proximity so that the operator sitting here can quickly move between the different keyboards. And Jeff Stye, WK6I, who operates from W7RN, always sets up at least 3 stations like this and is on 3 bands at the same time. I don't do it very often unless I want to have a station dedicated to 10 meters, for example. And the last slide here is a number of URLs for different resources that you can get more details on a lot of the things that I've talked about. Another thing I haven't listed here is you can go to the Tim Duffy's CTU site, where he posts all of the presentations from Contest University from past years. I give detailed presentations on RTTY and FT contesting there, and have for the last 15 years. And so all of those presentations are there with even more detail than what we've gone in today. So you can use those for reference resources. And with that, I'm done with the formal presentation, and I'm happy to take questions unless we're completely out of time.
Oh, thank you, Ed. That was great. While you were talking about different subjects, I was spinning around in my chair and fixing my setup on my shack computer. I want to thank you for that. Anybody have any questions?
Will the presentation be available?
Yeah, I'll send a PDF to Ken, and then he can distribute it or make it available however you guys want.
Yeah, I'll probably post it up on the groups.io file site. Okay. Any other questions?
This is great. I learned all the things I've been doing wrong.
Yeah, exactly. I noticed, I landed on just, playing around with it, landed on the 500 hertz filter, but I have to, because I'm using AFSK, I have to, sweep my shift almost 700 hertz to line up the tones within the filter. I guess that's pretty common, right?
No, it shouldn't be. maybe offline could go through your setup with you, but if you have your radio, if you have the whatever audio tone pair that you've chosen, you need to make it the same in the radio as it is in your software decoder. And then you shouldn't have to do any shifting in the radio at all. It should you should just be able to set the bandwidth and go. There shouldn't need to be any shifting. So there must be something that's set up in your configuration that's causing you to have to do that 700 hertz shift.
Okay, I'll have to look at that then. Okay. So just remind everybody that the CQWPX contest is next weekend. You'll be at Papa 49 X-Ray, right?
I take the red eye Monday night, and I'm actually staying down there 2 weeks, so I'll be doing a multi-single. I think we'll do multi-single rather than multi-two in the ARRL CWDX contest the following weekend. So be down there for a while.
Great. Excellent.
Ed,
All right,
Ed,
any
I
other
got
questions?
yeah, Ed's Eric KV1J. I just got a K4, and then its default mark tone was at 915, and there's all this discussion about it's better to be listening to the lower tones and all. But is there anything wrong with just going, and I set it back up to the standard mark tone. Is there any advantage really to the 915?
Yeah, the advantage is the fatigue factor, the operator fatigue factor. It's much more tiring to listen to high tones, the screechy high tones, than it is to listen to low tones. There's a second reason that really doesn't apply to the K4 or most situations now, but in AFSK, the higher tones you can get into or I'm sorry, in the lower tones, you can get into a harmonic situation where within the pass band, the second harmonic of the tone is in the pass band. So that's not an issue with our current generation of radios, but in older radios that was a consideration. But I strongly recommend using the lower tones because again, you're not listening to it for content. You're only listening to the RTTY tones for the absence or presence of signal, either the receive signal or your transmit monitor signal. So that's why I always use the lower tones, and probably the default in the K4 is a result of me being on the
I saw your name in some of the comments. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's probably just what's wound up being the default there. I guess the downside is that almost all decoders, the default for decoders and radios is the higher tones. And so there's less likely that you'll get things messed up, if you forget to set something. So that's, I guess, one advantage of using the high tones. But all you have to remember is to make sure that your tones are the same in the radio and in your software. Just those are the only two places you need to worry about. And it's just, think of it as the same thing as the side tone on CW. It only affects your local station. It has no impact on what goes out over the air. It's only what affects you locally, what you hear in your ear. And so that's why I advocate the lower tones.
Okay, thank you.
So there's a good contest this weekend for anybody who wants to try RTTY, the Mexico XE FMRE contest is good. It's in progress now and going to the end of the day, Sunday Zulu time.
Yeah, I would say, that's good for those of you that want to primarily operate the contest next weekend, to use the contest this weekend to test out your station and your operation. And then you also will have the opportunity this next Thursday night with the NCCC 30-minute sprint. And then I'll make an announcement early in the week about practices that'll be later that evening, half-hour practice for the contest, where you can actually use your CQ WPIX RTTY messages and test your actual setup for the weekend. And we'll have 2 half-hour practice sessions, one in the afternoon North American time, and then one in the evening that you can use for setting up your station and checking everything out. And believe it, as many years as I've been doing this, and the many tens of thousands of QSOs, I always discover stuff that I've got messed up when I do those practices. So it doesn't matter how many hours you have in this or how much experience you have, it's valuable to use those practice sessions.
I can attest to that. All right, is that it for questions?